Okay, hi everybody. We are up to chapter 6, and today we're going to be talking about social control, deviance, and crime. And just wanted to point out that deviance and crime are very different. They have some similar traits, but they're also very different concepts, and we'll talk about that today. The concept of social deviance, now we tend to think of deviance as a bad thing, right? If you're labeled a deviant, it's usually considered to be a pejorative label. But in sociology, deviance isn't necessarily bad. What deviance means is that it's a transgression against a norm, okay? It's just simply going against a societal norm. And deviance can be either informal or it can be formal. So, informal deviance are transgressions against norms, whereas formal deviance is the breaking of a law, of a criminal law of some sort. But think about what we define as deviant. Sometimes what we define as deviant changes over time, right? So it used to be a deviant act to have an interracial relationship, right? Uh, that was considered a deviant act. And it also, of course, used to be illegal. So that is where something deviant was also criminalized. And we saw the same thing too with same sex relationships. It used to be both illegal to have same sex relation, and it was also considered to be socially deviant. Now, today, same sex relationships are not considered to be illegal, are not illegal, but many still consider that to be deviant. And the same with interracial dating or interracial relationships. So that's what I'm talking about as far as deviance. It's simply going against a social norm. So if we expand that sociologically, right, being vegan, that is kind of against a social norm. We tend not to think of veganism as being transgressing or as a negative thing, but it still, might be considered unusual, right? Um, Men wearing eyeliner or makeup, that could be socially deviant. It used to be that tattoos were deviant, that people who had tattoos, that was considered to be a deviant act. That has changed, of course. It used to be considered deviant if you were a stay-at-home father, right? And in some communities that are very conservative or traditional, it still might be considered very unusual to if you're a father and you're staying at home taking care of the children. Okay, so that deviance is a very broad category. It's just anything that's against a social norm. And now, of course, um, you can have something deviant and criminal. So marijuana use is considered still deviant, even though it's illegal, even though it's legal in several states now, it's still illegal at the federal level. So, you still have this connection between deviance and criminal law, but what I'm saying is it's not always connected. You can have many things that are deviant but not criminalized, and you can have things that are criminalized but are really considered deviant, right? So um, I would say that looking at public opinion polling, the majority of Americans don't believe that uh, smoking marijuana is deviant anymore, but it's still criminalized in most states. So we'll go on to our next um, concept, which is social cohesion, and social cohesion relates to deviance. Social cohesion is a powerful social force that sort of keeps society grounded. It's kind of a social glue that limits deviance and also limits crime. Now, social cohesion is beneficial, but it can also be harmful in a way because it also is a form of social control, and it limits people's individual expression and it limits individual freedom. And the as Americans, right, we tend to really value freedom, we tend to really value liberty, and that comes at a cost as far as social cohesion. But then social cohesion can also be stifling. So there's always this give and take. But typically, what social cohesion is, it's the willingness of members of society to cooperate and to work together. And you do need you do need some social cohesion, quite a bit of social cohesion to have a society operating. And again, there's always this give and take between social cohesion and individual liberty. So, deviance also relates, of course, to social control in the formal sector. Okay, in the formal sector would be our formal laws and our criminal justice system. And punitive justice is more common historically throughout the world. Okay, you can see this with public hangings, with executions. You could see this with the execution of and beheading of Marie Antoinette in France. It's punitive justice has been replaced by rehabilitative justice in much of the industrialized, um, economically prosperous world. However, in the United States, we've become an anomaly. We were really focused on rehabilitative justice only for a few decades in the 70s and 80s. And we've kind of reverted back to punitive justice. And we're going to talk more about this when we talk about the criminal justice system. We have replaced rehabilitative justice with, and especially in the 1990s and 2000s, with a sort of get tough on crime approach. We ended job training for most of our prisoners in federal and state prisons. Pell Grants for students, Pell Grants for prisoners who wanted to be students behind bars was ended in the 1990s with welfare reforms. And so we've really become more law and order based since the 90s. And now this is changing again with social movements and social activists. And we'll see what happens. Um, but rehabilitative justice is becoming more common in wealthy societies outside of the US. So, for example, Germany, which is probably the most socially it's the society that probably is the most social democratic society around the world. And Germany has had far greater components of rehabilitative justice in their justice system for a long time. So inmates, for example, are actually given unemployment benefits while they're in prison so that they have money to pay child support, to pay the rent while they're in prison, so their families and their kids don't become evicted or homeless. The state pays for food aid for their families. Um, they get very extensive apprenticeship and job training programs while they're in prison, so that when they get out, they can work at a good job and repay their debt to society. So it costs a lot of money to do this, but right, there's a trade-off. Um, it's probably cheaper to pay for them to be in school and in these apprenticeship programs in the long run because then they're giving back to society once they get out in the form of higher incomes, and they're paying higher taxes too since they have jobs. So we're going to talk more about that, but we'll move on from here. So deviance and social control is really the set of mechanisms that create compliance in individuals. So we've talked about this a little bit, of course, but you can think of social control as mainly existing outside of the police, outside of the criminal justice system. Most people keep themselves in line for fear of being labeled a deviant just by their neighbors and by the people around them. So social control is mainly done outside of the criminal justice system. Social control is done through socialization. It's done by families, it's done by schools, it's done by religious institutions like churches and mosques and synagogues. It's even done by the media, for example, right? And so what social control is, it's just getting people to conform to society's rules. And you have informal social control, And you again you have formal social control, which is the prisons and the police. But informal social control is really just these unspoken rules and expectations about how to behave, right? So um, people are socialized not to yell or scream or burp or fart in public, right? We all enforce this. We all enforce this through informal social mechanisms and reactions that we give to people if they don't conform, right? So we all are sort of informal enforcers of the rules about how to dress, how to act, how to drive, how to raise your children, how to decorate your house, even how to keep up your front yard. And there are these things called informal sanctions, like dirty looks, snide comments, or even worse, if we breach, right? If we breach the norms. You see this happening on a day to day basis all the time. People sort of self police themselves, and we all police each other. And now that extends to formal social control, and that's when you get into the authority of the state, okay? Laws that um, are implemented and enforced through the state. And the police, of course, are the most visible actors in the state and state enforcement of rules and laws. Okay? So again, formal just means, these formal institutions like the police, like the courts, like the prisons that enforce rules and um, and deal with people who break formal rules and law. Okay, I'm going to talk not much about Victor Rios. I would have you read that in the chapter. It talks about how he was able to break through the system. He grew up very poor in a very high crime neighborhood where a lot of people were engaged in underground illegal activities, including the drug trade. He was lucky to be he was lucky to get access to resources, particularly adults who really intervened and really saved him. So he talks about being lucky that he was able to encounter the right adults that put him on the right path and gave him the right resources he needed to take his talents and to be successful. So, but I'll have you read that in the book. So let's move on to Merton then. Merton was a functionalist theorist who um, coined what's called strain theory. And strain theory is all about when deviance occurs because the society doesn't give its members the ability to achieve goals through socially accepted means. So strain theory argues that deviance exists because society does not allow all of its members to achieve its the socially acceptable goals through socially accepted means. And when people are blocked from society's socially accepted goals, they turn to other means to reach those goals. But most of us are conformists, okay? The overwhelming majority, Merton would argue, and I would argue this too. Just think about your everyday lives. Most people are conformists. They sort of accept the goals of society and the means of achieving those goals. And this is related to the concept of hegemony, right? Hegemony is like, the soft power that exists, and it's um, it's where we conform to the basic goals that social institutions and powerful social institutions lay out. And it kind of just becomes, oh, this is the way the world is. We have to conform to it. And that is conformist. And I would argue probably like 80-85% of the people in our society are conformists. Innovators are a very small group. There are people who accept the goals of society but look for new or innovative ways of achieving those goals. So these can be either what we would consider positive or what we consider negative. So innovators who, in a positive way, these might be entrepreneurs who try to solve a problem and make up, an invention or a technique that solves a problem, and then they get rewarded for that. But innovators could also be people who we can see as more nefarious. So people who see or look for weaknesses or loopholes in the system, like white collar criminals, people who are in private equity or hedge funds, and and they engage in and extra legal affairs, or they try to bend the rules, try to bend the system to their advantage, to make money, to gain influence, to gain power and status. So those would be what Merton calls innovators. And then you have ritualists, and ritualists are probably a larger group than innovators, or there are other uh, categories that we'll talk about. Ritualists aren't really interested in the goals of society, but they do accept the means of achieving those goals. So ritualists are probably those people who, you probably know a couple people like that. They might seek to do just the very minimum to maintain their life. Okay, right? So they may seek to do just the most basic thing necessary in order to have some of what society prizes, just the basic minimum that they need to survive. Retreatists are a very small group. They don't accept the goals of society or the means of achieving those goals. Think about people who might be people who want to live off the grid, right? So a very small group, people who want to live in isolated surroundings, away from everybody. Again, most people are not able to achieve that because we're very dependent on other people for our health, for our income, and so for our education. So retreatists are a very small group, and then rebels are also a very small group. Rebels don't accept the goals of society or the means of achieving those goals. You can think of rebels as sort of like these social movement leaders that reject society's norms and want to build new, but want really to build a new society with new values. You can think of people like Dr. King, like Malcolm X, like Lenin, like Che Guevara, like Gandhi, or even the person of Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth, obviously was a rebel. He didn't accept the social order. He wanted a new social order in Palestine. Harriet Tubman, Fannie Lou Hamer, Emma Goldman, Rosa Parks. Some of the authors, the famous authors, were rebels, like Victor Hugo, who wrote Les Miserables, Leo Tolstoy, who wrote War and Peace, and many other books. Today, people like Cornel West, who a rebel who wants to change the system to make it more equitable. These are again a very small group of people. You can think of them as being kind of your social activists in society. So that was the functionalist perspective. Now we turn to the symbolic interactionist perspective. Um, Symbolic interactionists, of course, take a micro view of society. They look at how people give meaning to their actions and events and experiences. And so symbolic interactionists really look at how people are labeled, okay? Um, and this comes down to what's a subfield of symbolic interactionism, which is labeling theory. Um, People see how they are labeled and and they may or may not accept this label as being true, especially if they're stigmatized. Okay, so let's talk about the difference here between primary deviance, the label of primary deviance, and the label of secondary deviance. So think about primary deviance as the first act of rule breaking. And this could result in someone being labeled a deviant, but they themselves don't consider themselves a deviant yet, even though society, or at least parents or teachers or the police, may label them as a deviant. So let's take the example of underage drinking, or you're in a schoolyard fight, and say then you get suspended or you get detention. But let's just stick with suspension. So the principal labels you as a deviant and you're suspended from school, but you yourself don't consider yourself to be deviant yet. Okay, that's primary deviance. But secondary deviance is when you sort of internalize your deviance and then you come to think of yourselves as criminal or deviant. And we honestly see this happening a lot with school suspensions. Um, and a lot of school reformers are actually seeing that detention and school suspension, and especially juvenile detention, creates the secondary deviance. And it's actually does more harm than good. When people come to see themselves as a deviant or as a criminal, they then reject society's socially approved ways of behaving and of being, and they develop an oppositional culture. So people who internalize the label of a deviant or of a criminal, they tend to develop an oppositional culture where they reject you before you reject them. So they reject school, they reject the criminal justice system, they reject the educational system, they reject the formal economic system, and it just drives them further and further away from socially approved goals. And so they will then maybe see themselves as rejecting school, rejecting formal employment, because they themselves don't want to be rejected. So they reject those institutions first. And what the research shows, it just makes people worse. What the newest research suggests is that if someone is misbehaving in school, there's usually a root problem. They're not getting enough love or attention at home. They have depression. They might have a drug problem. They might have alcohol problem. And what they need to do is not be kicked out of school. They need special services. They actually should be in school more, and they should have a social worker or a counselor assisting them. They should get special tutoring. They should get special assistance. Um, Kicking them out of school is actually probably the worst thing that you could possibly do. And then kicking them out of school and then putting them in juvenile detention without the proper services and support is the absolute worst thing that they could do. Unless it's a serious crime. Now it's different, if they've killed somebody or harmed someone severely. But things that are minor, like having a drug problem, alcohol problem, the absolute worst thing you could possibly do is put them in an institution where they're just being punished, or taking them out of school where they're just being punished. Okay, so that gets to this powerful notion of the stigma. Okay, a stigma is just a negative label that's attached to someone, and it can of course impact their self-concept and their social identity. And the entire groups can be stigmatized, right? So this is all what the police reforms are been about. The tough on crime, um, the broken windows model of policing, which criminalized entire groups of people, particularly young black men. It's essentially stigmatizing an entire group of people. It also stigmatized entire neighborhoods. So this tough on crime approach, what we've seen, this mass incarceration, even though 95% of people that live in these high crime communities are law abiding, the way our policing and justice system has worked is essentially has criminalized entire cross sections of the nation. It's criminalized entire communities, and that's been extremely harmful. Not just for the people who might transgress the social norms and the laws, but it's been harmful for all of the residents in these communities. It's been harmful for all of the people in these social categories. So we can see how powerful stigma is. Okay, and Zimbardo has talked about has talked about another part of the symbolic interactionist approach, which is the broken windows theory. Now, broken windows theory as a form of policing has largely been discredited. Okay, has largely been discredited. But the basic theory is that if you're in an environment of more social disorder, regular norms of behavior might be less likely to be followed. Okay? So, again, if you're in an environment of more social disorder, regular norms of behavior might be less likely to be followed. And so you can see this play out, right, with these protests that we've had lately, this spring. You have the thousands of people who are marching in the street who are mainly peaceful, right? Who are overwhelmingly peaceful. Um, but under the cover of these marches, you have this very small group of people who are taking advantage of this disorder, and they're looting and they're burning or damaging buildings. So this is what we see happening right now. But as a model of policing, the broken windows theory has been largely discredited. I'll just go through that in a minute here. The broken windows theory of policing alleged that if you allow these small transgressions to happen, then bigger crimes will happen. So communities that you had small transgressions happening, like jaywalking, like loitering, like jumping the turnstile, or not paying for the subway token and jumping the turnstile and getting on the train. If you allow those things to happen, then bigger crimes like robbery and homicide would happen. And that it's a theory that was developed by James Q. Wilson, who's a criminologist. But a lot, and then this was developed in the 1980s, and it really impacted policing, especially in the large cities like New York, where Mayor Giuliani took this broken windows approach, and really cracked down on every single small thing that was happening in public, including loitering. And it's largely been discredited by more recent criminal justice research. And what it ended up doing was really alienating all of the residents in those neighborhoods, especially young Black and Hispanic men who were stopped and frisked all the time. So we can talk more about that later on, but I just wanted to provide a quick overview of what this broken windows model is referring to. So we're going to just switch gears here a little bit and talk about crime. I don't really like this distinction the author makes between street and white collar crime. I think you have violent crime, you have property crime, and then you have white collar crime. Okay, so I would not use the term street crime. I would use the term violent crime, property crimes, and then corporate or white collar crimes as far as those distinctions. So violent crime, of course, are homicides, rape, domestic violence, robbery, assault. Okay. And what we don't see often is that most of violent crime is actually domestic violence. It's violence against people in their families, and that is the most common type of violent crime, and it's the most underreported. And until the 1990s, we didn't even consider domestic violence to be a crime because what happened in the home stayed in the home. It was the private affairs of the family themselves. But luckily, women were advocated for themselves beginning in the 80s and 90s. And because it is women who are mostly the victims of severe domestic violence, women and their advocates really put this into the public spotlight and got this as to be taken much more seriously. So this is why I don't like this focus on street crime, because most crime actually takes place in the home. Um, so that's of course street crime. Property crime are things like burglary, like theft of an automobile or theft of a television or something that was stolen. Um, and then you have white collar crime and corporate crime. White collar crime often does not get the attention that I believe it deserves. White collar crime is just as destructive as violent crime. Now, violent crime is destructive obviously because it harms the bodies and it harms the psychology of the people who are victims, but it also harms the psychology of an entire neighborhood. People who live in high crime neighborhoods are under constant stress that something is going to happen to them. And it takes a psychological toll and a mental toll on them. And it leads to a distrust of being permeated throughout that community. But white collar crime is equally destructive because what a white collar crime does, it creates distrust in all the social institutions in that society. And when you can't trust the social institution in the society fails to function right. So white collar crime is embezzlement, it's fraud. Fraud is lying about a product or service that you're selling someone, right? So fraud are these like scams, marketing scams, pyramid schemes. White collar crime is also market manipulation or stock manipulation. It's pushing stock prices up through an insider information, insider trading, and then selling at a high point before the stock or the market crashes. So insider trading would be considered market manipulation. And what we saw in the lead up to the last recession in 2009 was enormous, enormous amounts of white collar crime and fraud that was taking place in the real estate sector. So I'm not going to go into that very much, but what you had were these large investment banks that were pushing what were called mortgage-backed securities on institutional investors, people that ran pension funds. And Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and all the large banks, what they did is they packaged all these individual mortgages. Many of them were subprime mortgages, and they packaged those mortgages together to create financial instruments that they sold investors. And these financial instruments based on subprime mortgages were crap. They were actually called crap investments by people working in Goldman Sachs to begin with. And what they did was they sold these crap investments, and then they bet against them using financial derivatives. They bet against them because they knew that it was crap. They knew it was going to fail, but they sold all of these financial instruments to pension funds, like state pensions, teachers' pension, police and fire department pensions, and then ordinary retirees also um, bought these investment funds. And so what you had was you saw this, we eventually had a crash. So states and localities, state and local governments, regular investors, family members, they put all their savings in these funds that were garbage, and they were sold to them fraudulently, and they lost all their retirement savings. They lost all their rainy day funds, and that's why we went into a major recession in 2010 that we were just getting out of by 2015 or so, 2016. So white collar crime is very destructive because it leads to an immense amount of distrust in the society's institutions, and it trickles down. So people just don't trust banks anymore, but they start not trusting schools and universities. They start not trusting the media. They start to not trust the um, even as things as basic as they don't trust even small, local businesses and local businessmen and hospitals and so you just have this breakdown in the society, and the societies will fail if there's no trust in the social institutions. Okay, we're going to just go through this one very quickly. Deterrence theory is this philosophy of criminal justice based on the notion that crime results from a rational calculation of costs and benefits. There's some truth to deterrence theory, but there's also a lot of problems with deterrence theory. Deterrence theory assumes that people behave rationally. And what psychologists and sociologists and others have shown is that people often do not behave rationally. We're very much emotional creatures. We act on our emotions more than we act on rationality. So you have to take that as a discount. But there is some truth to deterrence theory. If we have harsher penalties on domestic violence perpetrators, they might, think more about beating up their girlfriends or their wives, right, or their kids. And we have strengthened laws against domestic violence, and it seems to be helping. Now, the same for white collar crime. Um, Many people believe that people who engage in white collar crime, who engage in fraud, those should be regulated more. They should be punished more, and that would reduce white collar crime and fraud and all of these um, illegal activities that are happening on Wall Street and banking, and in sales and market manipulation. And so that very much is the case. Harsher laws against those like embezzlement and fraud would probably reduce it. However, there's no evidence that harsher laws against nonviolent crime works, and harsher laws against like drug crimes probably even just make the situation worse. Um, our prisons are really overflowing in our country. We have the largest prison population in the world. We have 25% of the world's prisoners, but we only have 3.5% of the world's population. And the vast majority of people who are in prison are in there for nonviolent crimes like drug crimes, like drug sales or drug use, And what we've seen is that prisons just make the problem worse. So people in drug crimes, they should pay a restitution or they should get treatment. But the locking them up only makes the problems worse because it takes them away from their families and the communities. It takes them away from medical treatment. Um, it reduces the amount of, especially men in the community, that can be breadwinners, and it makes children more vulnerable. So, crime, prison population reduction would most likely be a good thing. Most criminologists now believe that, especially for nonviolent drug offenses. You maybe heard of the term recidivism. Recidivism occurs when a person who has been involved in the criminal justice system reverts to criminal behavior. But what most people don't realize is that a lot of recidivism happens because the tough conditions of parole. Okay, so you can, what happens when you're released from prison is you go on parole for a period of time. And what states have done, though, is make parole conditions very harsh and very strict. So failing to pay fines and fees back to the state in the allotted amount of time can mean that you break parole and then you're sent back to prison. Um, Failing to report to a parole officer on a weekly basis, that will lead you back to prison. And sometimes it's hard to make those parolee meetings every week if you lack transportation, if you don't have a car. Um, uh, you have to maintain a residence. That might be a condition of parole. And if you become homeless or if you don't have a permanent address, you are at risk for being put back into prison. Driving without a license, that's a parole violation. Even if you're trying to go to work or visit your family members or go to your parole meeting. Um, Drinking alcohol can be a parole violation. Going to a bar, being out after a curfew. These are all parole violations in many states, and it can lead you right back into prison. And so it's not just that people are committing crimes. Okay, so we're getting to Deva Pager here. Pager discusses this racism and stigma men face with a criminal record. And again, a lot of these criminal records are for nonviolent drug offenses. And this is what I'm saying. The criminalization of drug use has made the process worse. It actually has caused more harm than good. Um, why don't you read that in the book, of course? She discusses that in detail there. Okay, and then just a few more slides here. So again, as I said earlier, since the 70s, there's been a change in the US from a more rehabilitative sense of justice to a more punitive one. It's why we have the highest incarceration rates in the world. It's why we have 25% of the world's incarcerated individuals without having that much of the population. We have 3%, 3.5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's prisoners. So again, for violent crime, no one is talking about reducing incarceration rates. But for these nonviolent drug offenses, there has been much more talk about reforming those systems to reduce the incarceration rate. Um, Research has shown prison has very little effect on whether adults commit future crimes. And like I said, for kids, for juveniles, time spent behind bars actually makes the problem worse because they come to think of themselves as a criminal. They're socialized into the criminal world. Kids are taken away from healthy adult relationships. They're taken away from pro-social adults. They get behind in literacy, they get behind in school, they get behind in work experience. They're blocked from caring adults. That takes them out of the formal economy. So they have fewer opportunities once they get out. So it socializes them into being a criminal, and they are surrounded by the criminal element in prison. So this is what I'm saying, and what a lot of criminologists are now saying. They're saying that, um, especially for nonviolent offenses, some type of counseling, treatment, something, community service would be much more beneficial than prison, and save the prisons for the people who are causing real harm. The violent offenders, the people who have defrauded the American public of billions of dollars. Save those people for prison. Have the non-violent people, non white collar crime people be in some type of treatment program or community service program to repay the debts to society. Okay, so that's it for today. I hope this was helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions.